Good morning. Welcome to an introduction to carbon farm planning. My name is Matt Kruger, and I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Land and Water. We're grateful for the support that's been provided by the Sustainable Agriculture and Research Education Program, or SARE, to be able to bring this webinar to you today and to bring in our partners from the Carbon Cycle Institute to participate. We're quite excited to bring this opportunity for learning about a new approach to conservation to our members in county conservation departments all across the state of Wisconsin. But we're also excited to welcome in a wide range of participants from diverse and varied sectors, including academia, agencies, nonprofit, agricultural and conservation groups, foundations, tribes, agribusinesses, and representatives from a number of states, including Ohio, California, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, Texas, and probably quite a bit more. As the organization who's hosting this webinar, I'd like to take a couple brief minutes to introduce Wisconsin Land and Water to you. My screen will advance here. Pardon me for one second while we deal with some troubleshooting. There we go. Okay, refreshing. Wisconsin Land and Water is the host of this webinar. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3 membership organization that supports the efforts of 450 Land Conservation Committee members and 370 Land and Water Conservation Department or County Conservation Department staff in Wisconsin counties. We've been around for 68 years. We were established in 1953 to deliver conservation locally. As of this year, all 72 of Wisconsin's counties contribute membership dues in support of our organization. And we have a membership or a professional staff of 7 based out of our Madison, Wisconsin office. For those who don't know conservation in Wisconsin, we're pretty unique nationally. Most other states have a soil and water conservation district, which acts as their local conservation delivery infrastructure and mechanism. In Wisconsin, we don't have that. We run our conservation through our counties. We actually replaced conservation districts by statute, and we have developed in place of that land conservation committees that are housed at the county board level, made up of elected county board supervisors who oversee land and water conservation department staff. So you can think of it in the additional way that we're unique as an organization. We represent both the Land and Water Conservation Department staff, who are the implementers on the boots on the ground level of conservation programs. Those could be through our state's conservation programs, through the Department of Natural Resources or the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, but also federal programs like NRCS. And the other half of our membership are the local policymakers, land conservation committee members. In service of our members, we do provide a number of different programs and events. We have an active advocacy program where we're advocating for the county conservation department perspective on legislative and policy issues. We have a communications department whose function it is to really kind of amplify the good work that's happening on the ground for conservation impact. We house the Standards Oversight Council, which is another uniquely Wisconsin entity that facilitates the development and revisions of conservation standards in the state. So working with the Natural Resources Conservation on agricultural standards like the 590 nutrient management standard, and also working with our Department of Natural Resources to implement urban standards. We have a very active training program at Wisconsin Land and Water, where we provide technical resources and professional development opportunities to not only our conservation department staff and supervisors, but also our partners. And it's trainings like this that we regularly do in service of conservation in our state. And that includes our annual conference coming up March 2nd through the 4th in Wisconsin Dells. For those of you who are joining from Wisconsin, hope you can join us there. We also have a youth conservation education program, which is very unique, and we house the Wisconsin Envirothon, a conservation poster and speaking contest that culminates at our conference every year, and 2 youth camps, which we're excited to offer. And lastly, we have our climate resilience program, which has been developed to help counties better adapt to and plan for climate change impacts. And you're going to hear more about that in just a moment. Over the past several years in Wisconsin, like many places, we've been hit hard with extreme weather events, seemingly over and over again. We've seen floods, storms, rising groundwater and surface water levels, and droughts, which have affected our communities all over the state. In June of 2018, a series of torrential and sustained storm events dumped between 7 and 12 inches of rain across northwestern Wisconsin, causing massive floods, which ripped out culverts and bridges. It left state highways impassable for weeks, and it left communities isolated. The storms caused $13.1 million in damage to public infrastructure and left 6 counties along the Lake Superior shoreline declared as federal disaster areas. And the 3-day rainfall total in some parts of Bayfield County particularly approached 1,000-year rainfall marks. And all of this occurred on the heels of a similar round of storms that happened just 2 years earlier and from which the area was still recovering. So pretty devastating impacts that we've seen in the northwestern part of the state. Other parts of the state have seen similar impacts, however. Northeastern counties, such as Oconto, along the shore of our other Great Lake, Lake Michigan, have witnessed not only local storm events that have cut gullies across crop fields like the one you see in your picture and displaced thousands of tons of sediment in the process, but they've also been impacted by regional climate patterns that are affecting Lake Michigan itself. Lake Michigan's water levels have always been variable, but they've recently become more so, which is exacerbated by fluctuations in temperature, storm events, and evaporation. And I think it's safe to say that no amount of sandbagging is going to keep the encroaching lake at bay from overtaking the home that's pictured in the image on the left. And in the southwestern part of the state, which is characterized by steep topography and tight valleys of rivers and streams that flow to the Mississippi River, unprecedented storm events are also occurring. The August 2018 storm that happened dumped 10 inches of rain in 7 hours. And if you think about that for a second, it's kind of an unprecedented scale. It flooded homes in the process, and it damaged 5 of 7 earth and flood control structures in a single watershed. Now, these were dams that were built by the Natural Resources Conservation Service years ago to control floods. And it wasn't ever fathomed at the time that they were built that they would face storm events as significant as what we saw in 2018. And it was never fathomed that they would fail, but several of them did. And the thing that's important here is that this happened in the Coon Creek watershed, which is a name that some people might recognize. In Wisconsin, we kind of hold up this watershed as the birthplace of locally led conservation with the advent of the Soil Erosion Service in 1933. And the work of Hugh Hammond Bennett and Aldo Leopold, and really the watershed approach to conservation, all of which happened in this particular place that was impacted by these storms. So the Coon Creek watershed today bears the legacy of these past conservation efforts and continued conservation efforts, and features many of the conservation practices that were implemented then, including planting along contour lines, revegetated uplands and forest lands, restored streams that have been reconnected with their floodplains. But in spite of all of these conservation practices in place on the landscape, as well as well-managed farms, fields, and forests, even this watershed has proven to be susceptible to the devastating impacts of climate change. So we could spend the next several hours highlighting climate change impacts in every one of Wisconsin's 72 counties. And I'm guessing people joining from other states could probably do the same thing there. The take-home point I'd like to make is that these impacts are being felt across our entire state. They're being They're being felt across the entire region, across the country, and obviously even broader than that. So as we think about how we adapt to this changing climate, our boots on the ground conservation professionals are really on the front lines. They're the folks who are among the first responders when a catastrophe strikes. But even more importantly, they're instrumental in helping landowners build resistance before catastrophes strike and helping landowners to maximize the infiltration capacity of the land while minimizing the amount of rain and flood and precipitation that can flow off and cause erosion problems and massive flooding. So Wisconsin Land and Water has seen and heard the lived experiences of our conservation professionals, some of which we've shared with you in images today. And we understand very well how vital they are to building a more resilient landscape. We see it every day, we hear about it every day. Recently, however, policy leaders and climate researchers have also identified that critical role that conservation professionals play in helping prepare landowners and farmers to build a more climate adapted landscape. In 2020, December of 2020, Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers' administration released a climate change report to help us prepare for and mitigate against the effects of climate change throughout all sectors. And while the plan attributes 15% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions specifically to the agricultural sector, it's also the only major contributing sector that has the ability to shift from a net source to a net sink. And we think there's great opportunity here, and conservation professionals will be a vital part of that. Another recent publication, the Natural Climate Solutions for Wisconsin report, which was published by the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, identified opportunities for land managers and farmers around carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas impacts, and co-benefits such as water quality, biodiversity, soil health, and climate resilience. And another report, lastly, but certainly not least, is the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, that came out recently, that has issued an all hands on deck warning that we need to act immediately to reduce emissions. And it identifies, among many strategies, the need to integrate land interventions at the local level, which occur in concert with similar efforts happening at the regional and global scale. So all of these factors led Wisconsin Land and Water to develop our climate resilience program in support of our conservation professionals operating at the implementation level to help build resilience into Wisconsin's landscape. A central part of that is providing guidance on management practices that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase the landscape's capacity to absorb water, to retain soil, to filter nutrients, to restore hydrology, and to sequester carbon. So with that, I'd like to invite Christina Anderson, our Climate Resilience Program Manager, to highlight some of the resources that are available through Wisconsin Land and Water's Climate Resilience Program, and to also introduce our Carbon Farm Planning webinar today.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. As Matt said, I am Christina Anderson. I have the great pleasure of leading this climate resilience program that is bringing the webinar today. As Matt mentioned, our program has been developed to help counties better adapt and plan for climate impacts. We just wanted to take a couple of minutes here to highlight some of our program and offer some opportunities to engage with us. First of all, a major function of Wisconsin Land and Water is our training program. We develop trainings and promote events hosted by our partners. You can find a lot of these upcoming webinars or training opportunities through our events calendar on wisconsinlandwater.org. And we now have a category for climate resiliency, so you can filter out and find any upcoming climate related trainings hosted, whether it's from Wisconsin Land and Water or any of our many partners. We also are working to compile and develop conservation resources through our membership hub, which is also located on our website. As many of you know, if you start to look up what should I do for climate change, you are bombarded with a million pages of tools and resources, and we are trying to compile those and put them into one nice little website for our members to find reports, tools, and also examples of other counties taking action on climate. And of course, we advocate for locally led conservation. and have been working with state and federal policy programs to make sure that anything that's being suggested will be effective at the local level. Preparing communities to adapt to climate is going to take a big collaborative effort. So this is kind of my pitch out to you all, our members, to reach out to me at Christina@wisconsinlandwater.org to give me any feedback or resources, information that you need to help you work within your own communities, and any partners that are out there today that have resources to share or interested in learning about shared goals that we may all have together. Over the past year, we've really relied on the experience of our members and our partners to help us identify program priorities. And that's really why we're here today to talk about carbon. We find to be our first big step in how to connect our county members who primarily work with agriculture at many parts of our state. And as a great place to kind of initiate our talk, we have, there have been a lot of carbon related webinars over the past year. And most of them have been very eager to discuss the different market opportunities and or the challenges. And while we are very hopeful that there will be a potential to compensate farmers for helping to meet our global carbon goals and greenhouse gas emission reductions, our intentions with this webinar and our upcoming, we have an upcoming workshop, is to really consider carbon farming through a conservation lens. With this project, we really are hoping to improve soil health and build resilient soils by increasing soil organic carbon and preparing landscapes for extreme weather. And also to enhance the technical support of our county conservation members to help landowners navigate the many different opportunities and also potential challenges with optimizing carbon on their farm. And to empower conservation leaders to set local carbon goals, to evaluate what your opportunities along the different landscapes in your communities and how that all works towards our state and global goals. So we are excited to have partnered with partners here today that share a similar vision. We first met Carbon Cycle Institute about just over a year ago. They are a nonprofit organization that works closely with the resource conservation districts in California. They're here today to discuss their expertise in developing carbon farm plans, experience working with the many different state conservationists and landowners to rethink the landscape through a carbon lens. Jeff and Lynette, if you want to prepare or get yourselves set up, and I'll just mention here briefly while we're at it, is that we do have an upcoming webinar. It's a 3-week virtual workshop that we'll be holding in January and February. This is going to help get a little bit more into some of the tools and planning options. It's really meant for more of a technical audience, and registration will be opening here in the next couple of weeks, and it'll be a priority for land conservationists in Wisconsin, but feel free to reach out to me if you are interested and I will get you on my list. So let's see, with that, I think you looks good for me, Lynette and Jeff, if you want to go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.
Guess I have to unmute first. Good morning, everybody. This is Lynette Nieberge, and I am with Carbon Cycle Institute. I'm the Associate Director of Training and Education, and I've been working with CCI for the last 3 years, but actually 10 years when I worked at a resource conservation district, which is, you guys are a soil water conservation districts. I have a background in agriculture and forestry. I am actually from the Midwest, Illinois, and I attended the University of Illinois and then moved to California to work with the Forest Service. At that time, I discovered my love for soils, and I went to grad school at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and that's when I started working in carbon sequestration on rangelands. And at that point in time, I started working with the Marin RCD when I met Jeff Creek to start building carbon farming. And that was, I guess, in 2011 is when I started doing that. And since then, we've been able to work together and develop carbon farm planning and being able to build that out and distribute that and deploy it throughout the state of California and nationwide. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Lynette. And I really want to thank Matt and Christina for a really fantastic introduction. You really set the stage beautifully for the work we've been doing, really, and what we hope to share with you all today. My background, I farmed on the California coast for about 25 years before going back to grad school, first in agroecology, agroforestry, and ultimately getting a PhD in rangeland ecology from Utah State University. I spent most of my life in California. As Lynette noted, and we'll get into this as we move through the slides, we started really asking the question around, in fact, Lynette, if you want to move to that next slide, I could use that. We really started asking this question around the role of agriculture in climate change and the potential for ag to be a positive force in the climate change equation. We started that discussion in around 2006, myself and some landowners, the Marin Resource Conservation District, our local extension, University Extension office, and our local NRCS office. And that led us to a whole series of questions. Specifically, initially, we were mostly concerned about the question of measurement. How do we measure a change in soil carbon? And could we measure a change in soil carbon in response to an agricultural activity? And that led us to ultimately to a conversation with a biogeochemist at UC Berkeley, Dr. Wendy Silver, who had done a lot of work with soil carbon sequestration in tropical systems, but was very interested in our Mediterranean rangeland systems in California. And what you see on the left there is some of the very earliest instrumentation that we deployed to try to evaluate what our various agricultural practices on Marin County rangelands on coastal California, what the greenhouse gas signatures were associated with these various agricultural practices. Ultimately, to answer the question of whether we could measure a small increase in soil carbon that might be associated with an agricultural practice, we simply decided to add some carbon to the system and then come back and see if we could measure that change. And so what you see in the middle photograph there is carbon in the form of compost going out onto grazed grassland at the University of California Sierra Foothill Research Station up in the Sierra Foothills. And this was replicated on the coastal grasslands that you see on the right in Marin County, California. We basically put 1/2 inch of compost out on grazed grassland, no tillage involved. And these were grazed grasslands. And then proceeded to follow the trends in soil carbon and actually ecosystem carbon over the next 4 years, while now Dr. Becca Riles conducted her doctoral dissertation research on this very question. What you see on the right was the first thing we noticed was that the cows were gravitating to the compost treated plots, which was pretty interesting. And we all got a laugh out of that. But the fact was, when we analyzed the forage, we found higher protein in the treated plots, which was perhaps not entirely surprising, but it did explain the patterns we were seeing. But what we also saw was that we had achieved a change in soil carbon and that we could measure it. And that was really what we had set out to do. So we were pretty excited by that. What we had not anticipated was that change in soil carbon, that increase, continued for every year of the study, although we applied no additional compost. And I'll get into that a little deeper later in the presentation. But the revelation for us was that if we could initiate a process of enhanced carbon capture, we could actually initiate a process whereby the grasslands could begin to photosynthesize at a higher rate and capture additional carbon. So in essence, by adding some carbon to the system, we had enhanced the capacity of the system itself to capture more carbon from the atmosphere. That was a very unexpected and a pretty profound realization for all of us. That ultimately led us to the carbon farm planning work we're doing now, and I'll pass it to Lynette to go over the sort of the timeline of all this work.
Thanks, Jeff. So what Jeff had just explained to you is basically the start of where CCI came from. We worked with this collaborative of different entities, organizations in Marin. And then because this project grew so quickly and the interest grew so quickly, CCI was formed from the Marin Carbon Project in order to meet the capacity and build this carbon farming program throughout the state of California. As you know, most resource conservation districts or soil water conservation districts just work within their county. So we needed to help deploy this throughout several counties throughout California. And that's where we start to look at this timeline here. Jeff and the Marin RCD and among other organizations started out in 2008 trying to answer this question of carbon sequestration. But it was in 2013 when we were really trying to determine if we could bring this research to the landscape scale. And that's when we started working on our demonstration farms. We started with 3 demonstration farms and applied compost to about anywhere from 9 acres to 30, 40 acres to see how we could scale compost application. And it was at that time when we were doing this project that we realized, well, if we could store this much carbon in just one practice, what would a whole farm look like if we could plan for carbon sequestration on that entire farm with implementing a suite of practices and stacking practices on top of each other? And how much could we act? What is the potential of that entire farm itself? So between 2013 and 2014, we worked with Colorado State University to develop Comet Planner. And that's when we started developing our first carbon farm plans on those 3 demonstration farms. And then we completed those plans by 2015, and then we developed our first carbon farm planning training to help others understand how we came about this and what the steps you could take in planning for a carbon farm, and how you learn and teach your farmer about carbon farming. So in 2015 to 2022, I was still at the RCD most of that time, but Jeff at CCI would go around the state of California teaching carbon farm planning. And with my assistants, I would pop in if I could, if it was nearby. And then in 2020, which was just last year, we teamed up with Colorado State University again to develop an online curriculum of carbon farm planning. And this curriculum was developed as a tool to help us deploy training to a broader audience. So here in 2021, we started to test the carbon farm planning curriculum along with virtual webinars. 3 virtual webinars, which is something that you guys who follow along with this training next year will be going through. And we tested this with three different times. We tested it with North Carolina to see how well the curriculum worked with as a tool for our trainings. Then we tested it here in California with Chico State. And then we just did our last test with Cal Poly here in California. And that being said, currently we have trained this year over 100 people just this year alone. So there's such a growing demand for education and for helping others develop their own carbon farming programs along with carbon farm plans. I just want to show you right here is a map of California. And over the past 10 years, we've been able to bring together over 40 RCDs and partners to develop a carbon farm planning program. and then also be able to help guide them through creating carbon farm plans. So currently we've developed over 140 carbon farm plans here in California, which equates to over 70,000 acres. And we have about 99 carbon farm plans in progress. At this point in time, we've been able to train people up so they can help guide their other peers in planning and education. So just looking at this map here, I just really want to point out that anything that's colored or hash marks throughout the state, those counties have some type of carbon farm program, whether they are an RCD, a resource conservation district, or not. And the gray areas right here are RCDs that do not have a program right now. And most of these do not have a program because they don't have the staff capacity to build a program, but it doesn't mean that they're not interested. We do hear from them often and trying to figure out how they can build capacity. And one of the things we've done here in California recently in the past couple of years is we've started creating these hubs. So if you see a block of color right here is when a few of resource conservation districts come together to create their own hub to collaborate with funding and to share staff. And I'm having a little bit of issues with my internet, so I'm going to turn my camera off. I hope you don't mind. So moving on, because we have this high demand of education and to create this demand, we've been having a lot of people contact us from other states and wanting to learn more about how they can build their own programs and what it would take to build a carbon farm plan network in their area. So over the past years, we've been working with several states on helping them develop their own programs that fit their needs for their state. So if you see in the gray here, these are states that we have some type of communication with, ongoing communication, just to make sure that if they have questions, we can be able to be there for support or assistance. And some of them have already developed their own type of carbon farm planning programs themselves. And then the green states are states that we're actively working in now, which are North Carolina, Texas, you guys in Wisconsin, Oregon, and California. So one of the things that we're doing is providing these carbon farm planning trainings or providing assistance on educating them on how to write a carbon farm plan and walking them through a carbon farm planning process. And then that brings us to agriculture. And Jeff is going to kick us off with a little bit of understanding the role of carbon in agriculture and some definitions and really like diving in a little bit deeper to give you guys an understanding of the importance of carbon farming. And then I'll come back in to talk a little bit more about carbon farm planning. Jeff? Great,
thanks, Lynette. So my friend John Wick, who was a co-founder with myself and our Resource Conservation District of the Marin Carbon Project, originally going all the way back, has defined agriculture, I think, quite nicely as the art of moving carbon between carbon pools to produce the products of agriculture. And if we think about agriculture in those terms, then the nexus between agriculture and climate becomes very, very obvious. Simply the next slide, please, Lynette. The mechanism at work, of course, is photosynthesis, and the process by which plants use solar energy to draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, nutrients and water from soil to build their own protoplasm. This process of transforming solar radiation into biochemical energy, which all life on Earth is dependent upon. We also can think about the role that this photosynthetic process plays in providing that solar energy, that solar radiation transformed to biochemical energy to the soil ecosystem. And it's really that relationship, the transformation of atmospheric CO2 into plant protoplasm and photosynthates that end up in the soil ecosystem as simple and complex carbon compounds. That is really the process by which carbon sequestration occurs. And that's clearly the basis for all agricultural production. Next slide, please. So just a simple reminder that all of the carbon in the carbohydrates and the products of agriculture originates from the atmosphere. It's this very simple idea that really, I think, very powerfully builds this understanding of how agriculture can and really must play, and already does play, a role in the climate equation. Next slide, please. So again, this just emphasizing everything I've just said, understanding that carbon fundamentally is the energy currency of living systems, including our farm systems and all the farm processes, all the ecosystem processes that support our farming systems. Next, please. So the carbon cycle is this massive, long duration movement of carbon among the 5 major carbon pools on the planet. So we have done a very good job as hyperactive primates in removing fossilized carbon from deeply sequestered reservoirs of oil and coal and gas, combusting that to build our industrial civilization, and unfortunately using our atmosphere as a depository for the waste products of that combustion. Every time I show this slide, I have to update the numbers. I've kind of stopped doing that because it gets a little depressing as we see the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rising very quickly. The oceans, of course, have done a remarkable job of saving our bacon, in that they've absorbed a huge amount of heat resulting from global warming, as well as a huge amount of carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, as carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans, it forms carbonic acid, which is resulting in the acidification of our oceans, and we're seeing a whole cascade of ecological issues, problems arising from that warming and acidifying ocean. Folks have looked to trees and forests as a place to sequester carbon. Lots of folks advocating for planting more trees, and I would certainly support that concept. But those of us in the West of the United States are unfortunately seeing our forests turning into sources of carbon due to the enormous amounts of both the frequency and the magnitude of forest fires that we've been witnessing over the last decade or so. And so forests, for at least for those of us in the arid and semi-arid regions of the world, simply are not a reliable carbon sink at this point. And so we look to soils. The beauty of soils is that as we increase the carbon content of our soils, we start to see all kinds of very positive things happening, both for soil ecology itself, but also for productive agriculture as well. Next slide, please. So these are just a few quotes that I've collected over the years. It's important, I think, that we understand that agriculture's role in the carbon cycle has not, for the most part, been positive. An enormous amount of carbon has been lost from our soils to the atmosphere over time, over the 200 years or so of industrial agriculture. At the same time, agriculture is really more vulnerable to and exposed to climate change impacts really than any other human endeavor. As we all know, of course, being unable to rely on weather patterns is really devastating for agriculture. Changes in rainfall quantities and frequencies, frost dates, first frost dates, last frost dates, all of these things begin to have a very severe impact on agriculture, which really needs to be able to have some degree of predictability in those large weather patterns. And then finally, this is a very important point, that it is really only the soil that offers us a truly viable option for achieving negative emissions, that is the drawdown of carbon dioxide, all that surplus CO2 in the atmosphere. It's our soils that offer us the biggest hope as a place to store beneficially that surplus carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. So this is a sort of a combination of a couple of concepts here. Sanderman and others published a paper in 2017 where they really tried to quantify the amount of carbon that has been lost from our soils globally, our agricultural soils specifically, from both our grazing lands and our croplands. And you can see that inset graph there showing the soil loss, grazing lands in green and croplands in brown. Grazing lands have lost more carbon simply because there's much larger area of the earth it falls into that grazing land category. But nevertheless, you can see this very steady increase in soil carbon loss going back 2,000 years in this case, but then very rapidly increasing with the Industrial Revolution. So around the mid 1700s, our capacity to disturb ecosystems as our technology advanced really enabled the accelerated loss of carbon as human population increased and demands on our working landscapes increased. The larger graph there is a record of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see it really parallels within that time frame from the 1700s through the present. It has a very parallel signature to the loss of carbon from our soils. Now, most of what's driving that rapid increase, particularly since the 1950s or so, is fossil fuel combustion. But it has been aided and abetted, if you will, by the loss of carbon from our working landscapes. About 27 to 30% of the surplus carbon in the atmosphere is a direct result of the way we have managed or mismanaged, if you will, our working landscapes. Now we're currently sitting at 414 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. We should ideally be at about 280. So we have a long way to go in terms of restoring some kind of equilibrium to the planetary climate system. Next slide. So I've talked a little bit about systems, and I want to just throw a little bit of formal systems theory into this discussion because it has, for me personally, been very, very helpful in understanding what it is exactly we're dealing with and how we can actually dig ourselves out of this catastrophe. Very simply, we can think about systems such as a farm system or a global system as remaining the same or changing. Really very simple. They're in one state or the other. That's either remaining the same or it's changing. And that sameness or equilibrium is really maintained by what we call negative feedbacks or deviation dampening feedback. So as the system begins to move away from its central tendency, some feedback brings it back to negatively back to its original state. Now, a system change where we go from one system condition to a different system condition is driven by an opposite process of positive feedbacks or deviation amplifying feedbacks. So as the system begins to change, it continues to change in that same direction. And these positive feedbacks drive that change away from that original equilibrium state to some, presumably eventually some new equilibrium state, but that transition can be a very dramatic disruption of the previous system. Next slide, please. So as an example, a very simple example of a negative feedback process or deviation dampening process is a thermostat, right? Where the room, heat comes on, the room warms up at a certain temperature, the thermostat senses that heat and it shuts off the furnace. And then of course the room begins to cool, and at a certain threshold temperature, the thermostat kicks the heater back on and the room warms up again. And so we have this negative feedback that keeps the system from getting the room, in this case, from getting too warm or too cold, and keeping it fluctuating around that central tendency that we call a comfortable room temperature. Next slide. we have a rather dramatic example of positive feedbacks at the global scale, illustrated in the melting of Arctic ice. And these two images, about 40 years apart, 30 years apart. This is an example of a deviation amplifying process. So as the globe has warmed, Arctic ice has begun to melt. And as Arctic ice melts, it exposes dark water at the North Pole. Dark water, of course, can absorb solar radiation at a more rapid rate than white reflective ice. And so further warming occurs in response to that initial warming. And as more ice melts, more dark water is exposed, more warming occurs. And so the system is moving in a direction that is probably not a desirable one for us as a species on a planet that evolved under quite different conditions. And this I think is a very dramatic example of a positive feedback process. Next slide, please. So if we look at the record of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back, in this case, 800,000 years, we actually see a fluctuation around a central tendency. The carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have changed dramatically over the millennia, but they've always remained, as long as we've been a species on the planet, they've always remained fluctuating around this central tendency, around somewhere between 190 and 290 parts per million. And it's gone up and down as the Earth has gotten closer or further from the sun, and as the global biology has responded to that by increasing plant growth as the planet has warmed, drawing down more CO2, and thereby driving cooling of the planet. And so we've had this beautifully balanced system fluctuating, not always changing, of course, but fluctuating around a central tendency. But that red circle there shows you where we are relative to that historical trend of homeostasis. And we are clearly moving in a direction that has nothing to do with the planet as we have experienced it throughout our evolution as a species. Next slide. So for those of us in California, we really now have to ask this question. This image is from the Oklahoma Dust Bowl era of 1935, but I'm afraid we could find images pretty much like this in California today. And as our state dries up, and essentially as we watch the process of desertification take hold, particularly in the southern reaches of the Central Valley, we really have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about this? This is not a question for the future. This is a question for now. Next slide, please. So as Matt mentioned, this phenomenon, these various disruptions of climate are really happening globally. You folks in Wisconsin have faced water. We face fire in California and drought. This is a global phenomenon, and it was entirely predicted and was predicted and has been predictable for a long time. As in fact, going back to the late 1800s, when Arrhenius first put forward this idea that as CO2 increases in the atmosphere, global temperatures would increase. As global temperatures increase, that additional energy available to the global climate system results in these catastrophic shifts, at least catastrophic from a human perspective. And the situation is obviously getting worse. It's getting worse very quickly, and we do need to act now. Next slide, please. So again, we can think about managing carbon as a way to manage this excess energy that's now in the atmosphere. So because of this direct relationship between solar energy and photosynthetic capture of carbon from the atmosphere by the primary producers, the plants, and then the subsequent flow of that solar energy through the ecosystem, right? And we can imagine this is a farm ecosystem where that little mole there on the lower right becomes perhaps a cow or a sheep. It is this flow of energy from the sun through the plants into the soil through the farm biota or the ecosystem biota. This is the process that we're talking about. And by managing that flow of carbon intentionally in our farming systems, we have an incredible opportunity to affect globally, if we can scale this work, this excess of energy that's currently warming our planet, while transforming it into the useful products of agriculture, as well as soil fertility and productivity. So it's a potential win-win situation if we can activate this at scale. Next slide. So how do we do that? How do we manage the flow of energy through our farm systems? And what we do that by messing with those systems, by disturbing them. This is an example of an intensive grazing trial on one of our carbon farms in California. And you can imagine the difference in ecosystem impact of managing these animals as a very tight herd, as opposed to just letting them, opening the gate and letting them wander out across that larger landscape. So again, it's a question of how do we impact our systems, at what scale does our disturbance, if you will, occur, can determine how much carbon we capture and how much we retain within the system. Next slide. So here's an example of what is really quite a conventionally managed walnut orchard on the left. There's no cover in this orchard. The argument there is that a cover crop would be drawing nutrients and water from the trees, and therefore we're going to manage with bare tillage, with bare soil. And then an alternative approach with a very, very productive cover crop within a young walnut orchard on the right. And if you stop and think about which of these systems is capturing more solar energy, and which of these systems is building more soil carbon and storing more soil carbon. So it really becomes an opportunity for us as land managers to think about what are all the ways that we might increase that capture of solar energy, and then its transfer first to the soil, but also to the products of agriculture. How can we use that surplus to build our own productivity? Next slide. So this is, in many ways, this slide encapsulates all the lessons we learned from 4 years of research at the Marine Carbon Project. The black line there, you see the hockey stick, is in year one, the application of ½ an inch of compost to our grazed grassland system. And you can see that rapid decay rate of that compost. Very quickly, that carbon is returned to the atmosphere as CO2. Well, I say quickly, but it's actually over several decades. But that was pretty much what we expected to find when we initiated this experiment. But what we didn't expect, and which was really the take-home impact for us, was the scatter diagram you see in the background. The response of the ecosystem to that single application of additional carbon it resulted in enhanced photosynthetic capture of carbon from the atmosphere by the growing pasture. And with each passing year, we saw additional carbon, because with each influx of carbon into the system, there was additional water holding capacity in that soil, additional fertility in that soil, all of that driving additional plant growth and additional capture of carbon from the atmosphere. Now, the model here, and these are obviously modeled results because we don't have 100 years of data. The model shows that this increased capture of carbon dioxide in response to a single application of compost, in this case, is likely to continue for 30 or 40 years or more before gradually beginning to taper off. But even at 100 years, we still have more carbon in the system than we started with in year one. So this potential to initiate a positive feedback process, a deviation amplifying process, or a virtuous cycle, if you will, is really the opportunity that we see before us as we think about the role of agriculture as a climate change solution. Next slide. And that's, I think, well illustrated in this image from Dr. Ratan Lal's work from 2015, where he really talks about this relationship between farm energy content and farm productivity. And associated, of course, with an increase in farm energy and farm productivity and farm carbon are all the ecosystem benefits, all the conservation benefits that we associate with conservation agriculture and historical conservation practices. So by practicing a carbon-focused agriculture, where we're really looking for ways to build the carbon content of our working farms, not just the soils, although soils are critical and our biggest potential carbon sink, but also in our windbreaks, our shelter belts, our hedgerows, all of these opportunities for carbon capture, both above and below ground, are really tied to classical farm conservation practices going all the way back to the Dust Bowl and long before as well. So we really have a choice in agriculture at this time to continue a somewhat extractive model where we see a decline in soil carbon and generally ecosystem carbon in our farm systems, what we might call an extractive agricultural model, which, as Americans coming into an open country and virgin soils and all of that historical mythology, that's the style of agriculture we developed over years. But this opportunity to actually build soil in place through the capture of carbon and nitrogen from our atmosphere and build our farm system fertility and productivity in place is really the opportunity that this model presents us with. And of course, the climate crisis has simply put all of this into very sharp focus. Next slide. So I just pulled this straight off the NRCS website, and it's really gratifying to see this shift in thinking. Following the Dust Bowl years, we came up with this concept of tolerable soil loss and the idea of managing fatigue. You can afford to lose a certain amount of soil each year because you're making a certain amount of soil each year. And every soil survey in the country has identified that T value, that tolerable soil loss that we can afford to lose from every acre of ground. And we finally realized that is really not an option, particularly in our current crisis. We really need to manage for carbon increases in our soils, not soil loss. And so I think this is a critically important shift in our farm conservation thinking. And of course, it ties directly to the climate question. So I'll turn this over to Lynette at this point, and she'll go into some detail on the planning process.
Thanks, Jeff. Before we move forward, I just want to address a couple questions that I think fit really nicely here. We do have one question about the compost application, and does that account for the CO2 loss in the composting process? Do you want to speak towards that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I want to say two things here. One, I don't want people to get stuck on compost as a strategy. It is a great strategy. We were using compost to test a hypothesis. So compost is a powerful tool. I strongly advocate its use and production, but I want to really highlight all the other strategies we have available to us to build soil carbon. But to answer the question directly, that's a great question, because if we're looking at the climate and we say this particular practice is a climate solution, we have to understand the greenhouse gas signature associated with that practice. And in the case of compost, we conducted a full life cycle assessment on compost production and use, and showed that it was a very significant net benefit. And that makes sense if you think about it, because composting is really just a means to conserve carbon on farm. So once you've captured that carbon in plant biomass and animal biomass, how do you maximize its retention on farm? And one way to do that is to take all of your farm waste products and run them through the composting process, so they're stabilized and turned into a somewhat more recalcitrant form that can then be added to the soil and more stably retained in the soil system for a longer period of time. So it's a really good question. And as I say, we did conduct a full life cycle assessment on that and showed a very strong net benefit overall, including transportation emissions, equipment emissions associated with industrial compost production, and as well as trace nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions that sometimes come off of active compost piles. So definitely a strong positive benefit to that compost application.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We do have a couple other questions, but I think that we may address some of those throughout the rest of the PowerPoint. So if we don't, we'll come back to those questions once we wrap up our presentation. So like Jeff said, we're going to get into a little bit of what is carbon farming and carbon farm planning. One of the things that we really want to bring across that basically all farming is carbon farming. Really thinking about carbon entering the farm from the atmosphere and how it ends up in one of three pools, which those could be harvested portion of the crop, or in the soil as organic matter, microbial biomass, and plant and animal residue, thinking back to that soil web graphic that Jeff showed earlier, thinking about how that solar energy moves through our systems and how it can be stored in those pools. And then the last pool is standing carbon stocks on farm, including perennial crops and permanent vegetation such as windbreak, shelter belts, riparian vegetations. But really what we want to get across is that all farming is completely dependent upon this atmospheric carbon dioxide in order to produce its product. But the thing to keep in mind is that different farm practices and different farm designs can lead to different amounts of carbon capture and loss on the farm. So really taking into account when you are planning for a producer, really thinking about their landscape and what that landscape is capable of, because each farmer we work with is different, each landscape is different that we work with. So really keeping that in mind. So getting into what is carbon farm planning? Well, carbon farm planning is a whole farm approach to optimizing carbon capture on working landscapes. So what we do with carbon farming is we really think about what all that entire potential is on that landscape, not really for that first 5 years of planning, but we want to think long-term. What can this long-term potential be? And how can we think about storing carbon beneficially in long-term through decades and centuries? And so that's one of the things with this carbon farm planning differs a little bit from conservation planning, is that we're thinking this long-term goals, and we're actually teaching this producer about what those long-term goals are and how much carbon they can store and what that looks like from the baseline of where they are today. So carbon farm planning is really based off of the NRCS conservation planning process, but we use the carbon cycle and carbon capture as our organizing principle in which we construct these plans. So one of the reasons why we do use the NRCS conservation planning as our base for this process is because it's universal nationwide. We're all learning this as planners, and it really has a great flow and concepts of what we need to, and how we look at that landscape. And the NRCS helps to provide trainings in this and certifications. But what we did was we took that, we modified it to really think about carbon as the organizing principle. As you can see in this graphic right here, carbon is the center of all these elements in our farm production. So it's the keystone for agricultural production and resilience. And I think that Jeff did a really good job of explaining this in the first half of this presentation. So going again and back to what carbon farming is, this is really a creative exercise that the planner has with the producer, really thinking about what that whole farm potential is on that landscape and how you can really increase carbon sequestration, decrease your greenhouse gas emissions relative to the current condition on land. one of the things that we don't do in our carbon farm plans is we do not calculate what those greenhouse gas emissions are. We start from baseline and really look at what's going on that farm today, and then how we can increase our carbon capture. And one of the reasons that we do it this way is because we really believe that we want to incentivize the producer for what they're doing and how they can look at their landscape. We don't want to tell them, like just telling them what negative things they're doing, because negative reinforcement isn't really going to go help us get anywhere. So really being positive about how we can present this information to our producers and how we can teach them that how they can change their management on their landscape can actually increase carbon capture. So really thinking about how you're speaking to your producers really goes a long way as well. So that brings us into tools for carbon farm planning. One of the things that we do as planners, whether it's here in California, there in Wisconsin, or in North Carolina, is that each of you as planners and as resource conservation districts, soil water conservation districts, are basically, you need to build your toolbox for carbon farm planning. For each carbon farmer in each area, your toolbox is going to look a little different. So one of the things that we really want to emphasize here is that each area is going to have its different set of conservation practices that work for their landscape and for their area. So thinking about what those are and what maybe supporting practices are to help enhance those carbon farm practices. So I'll get into this a little bit later. So we do in our carbon farm plans write in fencing or water developments to help move animals and your livestock through your systems, because without those supporting practices, it's going to be hard to actually implement your actual carbon beneficial practices. And then one of the other things that you've noticed here probably is that we work really closely with conservation districts and the NRCS to help provide technical service assistance to our producers. And it's really important that we're building a team of people here to write a carbon farm plan. Not all of us are experts in everything that we plan for. So really making sure that our team to write a carbon farm plan, we have different experts to help us write those different sections of a plan. And oftentimes relying on the NRCS and different conservation districts and sharing maybe the UC extensions or whatever technical experts you have in your area, bringing them together to really form a partnership and a group that you can really move your carbon farm planning programs. And most importantly is making sure you're engaged with your producer throughout the whole process and helping them understand the reasons why you're planning for what you're planning for and what that means as far as carbon sequestration. On top of that, throughout our trainings, we do bring in to our trainings how to use the Comet Farm tools for modeling these conservation practices, and so you can determine what that potential carbon sequestration is. And then really thinking about what other tools you're going to need for your planning process, whether that's mapping tools using ArcGIS, QGIS, Google Earth, but really being able to map out what you're planning for. And then if you don't have real data for that specific farm, really looking at the web soil survey. The web soil survey is a great tool to utilize to understand what maybe that baseline is for that soil type that you're working with. So with carbon farm planning, the whole process of planning, we can look at really need to look at our landscapes and how we can start to diversify on-farm systems to support enhanced carbon capture. So really thinking about what practices those might be in order to build that resiliency within your system. So if that's implementing, some type of cover crop in place of bare fallow, crop rotation, intercropping, integrating livestock into your systems at different areas and different times. So making sure you really understand the timing of introducing your livestock into your systems, maybe introducing more agroforestry practices for structural diversity, and to also enhance your microclimatic diversity, and also you're increasing your habitat and wildlife diversity, more so also increasing your soil organic matter to really build that soil food web diversity. So that brings us into really thinking about on each farm that we go into, how are we going to build resilience to increase temperatures and extreme heat events? And how do we scale this, and how do we adapt to these extreme temperatures and heat that we're facing? So right here on the right hand side, we've been working with several people who are installing solar panels, but they're actually starting to graze under them or plant crops under them. So this is called agrovoltaics, and I know a lot of people are really looking into how they can incorporate this into their farm systems a little bit more. So one of the things we really think about when building resiliency to these different events, such as temperature, flooding, extreme heat, fire, is looking maybe over here, we have a couple examples of our cropping systems. Really diversifying due to to distribute the risk of what's happening. I'm really thinking about intercropping for microclimate benefits, selecting heat tolerant crops and varieties. One of the things as planners we need to start thinking about is some of the practices that we have right now may not be the practices that we're going to be implementing, in 10 years. So really thinking about these practices and these plantings and how our temperatures are going to change over time, or our droughts are going to affect us over time, and what plants are going to be tolerable. Thinking about how we can distribute water, with these extreme heat events. So these are just a few to think about for increased temperature and extreme heat events. And then again, thinking about increased drought and fire, really thinking about how we can increase that soil organic matter and soil structure to increase the soil's water infiltration and water holding capacity. What types of practices can really address those benefits there? So possibly thinking about compost application, reduced till, cover cropping, and again, introducing livestock into your systems. And one of the big things is really maintaining soil cover to moderate those soil temperatures and to reduce from evaporation, and really to help increase your infiltration. So there's several things here that we have listed out that can help address increased drought and fire. For you guys, really thinking about increasing your resilience for your heavy precipitation and your pluvial flooding. So what are some things that you can start to adapt to and start to plan for now to help address these issues that you're having? So really, thinking about increasing soil organic matter, soil structure, and for your water infiltration, water holding capacity, thinking about strip cropping, alley cropping, vegetative buffers, reducing erosion, increased infiltration through vegetated waterways. I know that Matt said that there in your areas, you've really been working on implementing practices, but we need to think about a full landscape of being able to implement these practices and deploy carbon farming, and really thinking about how we can build those resilient systems there in your area for additional, in the future of flooding. So really thinking about all of our riparian restoration work that we could do and how we can enhance water absorption through buffer drainages and landscape restoration on the watershed hydraulic, like the watershed scale itself, and how we can build that diversity and biodiversity within our habitats. And then again, building resilience to increase windstorms, really thinking about different avenues, really thinking strategically. Right here, we have a vineyard where they're starting to plant trees in between their rows to help with reducing the wind speeds and providing shelter and windbreaks. Thinking about, I think in the background here, you can see they have a bit of a windbreak or shelter belt back there too, protecting their crop. So thinking about what things can help us prevent from wind, also from evapotranspiration, how we can really maintain that soil moisture and water holding capacity, and to increase our soil organic matter and our soil structure, and protect that really against different types of erosion, wind erosion, water erosion. And then last of all, thinking about building resilience to changing pest and disease pressure. I think this is really important to think about as we start to diversify our crop systems. Our plants and diseases are also going to change with these extreme weather events as well. So thinking about how you long-term, how to diversify your crop rotations to break these pest cycles and disease cycles. Really thinking about how you can manage, maybe integrating livestock into your systems to maintain healthy pastures and introduce appropriate disturbance. And there's several other things that we can think about during this, but when you're planning, it's really, we need to start thinking about, as things change, everything else is just kind of go along with that change. And so how do we think about these carbon farm plans strategically when we need to build resilience, and how we can really think about what we need to plan for what's coming up and how we're going to adapt to this. So I'm going to pause for a moment and see if Jeff has anything to add with building resilience. Jeff?
Yeah, I think the point, which I think Lynette has made well, is that as we focus on carbon farming for climate, we're also addressing the question of adapting to the inevitable, and it's really a question of how do we make our farming systems more able to buffer the extremes that we're already experiencing, and I think that very extensive list that Lynette just provided gives you all a sense of how carbon farming, if your producer is not necessarily enamored of a conversation around climate, they may very well be interested in discussing how they're going to build resilience within their farm system in the face of the obvious changes that are happening. So fortunately, the approaches we take toward building carbon in our farm systems also can be deployed to address the kinds of challenges that we've just gone through a long list of the potential challenges that we're all going to be facing in production agriculture.
All right, thanks, Jeff. That brings us to really being able to display what we're thinking to a producer. So really creating a map. One of the things that we found that has been really beneficial to our producers here is creating a map that people can really look at to understand what we're planning for. So right here is a actually it was a dairy here in Marin County that Jeff and I worked on this carbon farm plan quite a while ago, but this to me was such a great plan, and to really think about climate change, because right here we have tidal influence coming in, and the loss of this pasture over the last several years has really impacted their production. So because of sea level rise, they have lost most of this pasture. So what we were thinking is, how can we plan for this ranch to a dairy to utilize this pasture when it's not flooded? What do we need to do? How do we think about this? What can we plan for? And then along the side with that, eventually, with the tidal influence here, much of these pastures right here are going to be underwater. So one of the things that in this plan we really thought about is, how can we move the animals strategically through this area to increase soil organic matter. They really had a lot of bare ground here before we started working with them, and this farm, this dairy was really infested with weeds. Jeff can probably speak towards what types of weeds were there, but this whole area, when I first started working with this ranch, this dairy here was pretty much all weeds. And so this picture up here on the left-hand corner is really a picture of what it looks like today, and how Jeff has been working with them to really help them understand how they need to move their livestock through this area, and really helping them determine what types of seed mix they need to integrate into their system to outcompete those weeds. And then what other actually what's happening now is, now that they're out competing the weeds, their natural seed bank is starting to come up. So really thinking about what that means. And over here we have a riparian area that we plan for. We are experiencing flooding from our rivers right now, and creeks, and I think this was actually almost a month ago, we had an atmospheric storm, and this whole area just flooded. And thinking about that watershed, what's above in this watershed, and how that's impacting this dairy, was really a key thing in our planning process. So one of the things that I just wanted to show you is how you can display your information on your maps. We have hedgerows and windbreaks here, and these yellow and orange and green colors, and then just herbaceous plantings throughout these ephemeral streams right here, and being able to really fence out these areas strategically. So these fence lines right here are permanent, or not permanent, they're temporary fencing, so they can seasonally graze and not cause more damage or compaction in the wet season. So with our plans, we also list all of the practices that we've planned for and the total acres, along with the carbon dioxide equivalent and what that sequestration rate is that we just modeled through our COMET tools. So that way, when a producer gets this map out, they can kind of see what their potential is. And so when they're thinking about planning and what they're going to plan for, they kind of know what they want to start with to sequester more carbon. And that leads us into the growing awareness. So right here, we've already talked about how more people, we're training more people, and the capacity of what we're training is growing, and we're a small organization. And really thinking about how this growing awareness is changing for the potential of carbon farming. And throughout the country here, these state healthy soils legislations are coming up. And this map right here is a little bit older. It's from June 10th of 2021, but this just displays for us what's happening throughout the country. So the green right here is basically legislation has passed some type of carbon farming or healthy soils legislation. Blue, those states are pending. Purple, they're actively working on something, and the peach, I guess that's peach, is there's growing interest right now. And Jeff, do you have a little bit more to say about this?
Yeah, only to say that we've been getting updates to this map about every other month. and the speed with which the country is turning green is quite amazing. So yeah, as Lynette said, this is actually a little outdated now. There's a couple more green states in there, and obviously folks are getting, there's just increasing interest in the whole idea of healthy soils, which we could get into a long conversation about what that means, but the bottom line tends to be everybody's looking at soil organic carbon, and how we can build soil carbon, whether it's for climate reasons or for all the environmental benefits that Lynette has outlined. So it's been gratifying to watch this happen very quickly over the last year or so.
Yes. And that brings us to, because of this, we really need to build our capacity and partner with our partners in our soil water conservation districts to really be able to deploy carbon farming. And that goes hand in hand with carbon farm planning. We need to increase our capacity on the ground with our technical service providers so we can educate these producers, and so we can write these plans, so then we can secure funding for actual implementation on the ground. There's a bottleneck here in California. We don't have the financial support for our producers to actually implement all of these practices. It's something that we work on constantly. And we are gaining traction with the NRCS and EQIP, and being able to secure funding for practice implementation. I'm not sure how it is there in Wisconsin, but I know that several of our practices that we do that our RCDs do want to fund for implementation to work with their producers through the NRCS. The dollar amount doesn't equal out, and it's not beneficial for the producer to implement these practices. One being windbreaks. The cost to implement a windbreak can be quite high, but the dollar amount that the NRCS EQIP funds can contribute towards are quite low. So we're really working in our state here to figure out how we can fundraise more and work with our state and work with the NRCS to increase those cost shares for implementation dollars. And really important about building this capacity is something that we're very adamant about is sharing our resources so we can help other people develop their own carbon farm programs. So like for the state of Wisconsin, we're here today to work with you to share our knowledge, to help train up your planners in your state, and to really help you think about different ways of building your own carbon farming program there and how it will work for you. And then really building your communications and being able to share your resources, whether that's through websites, list servers, and webinars. One of the things that we do offer at CCI for our planners that go through all of our training is ongoing webinar learning. So each month we do something called a cafe hour. So for the planners who are working on carbon farm plans, we use that hour to present a new topic that they're interested in. And then we give a half hour of that for a conversation of how we can think about a new practice or a new question that they have. So those cafe hours are really highly driven upon the needs of what those planners are wanting us to provide them with additional education on. So sometimes we look at research papers that are coming out and how that relates to their work today. So those cafe hours do vary because there's only so much that we can cover in a training. And that kind of brings us to really needing more planners and practitioners on the ground and really being able to educate everyone about the role of carbon in agriculture. So like I said earlier in that timeline, last year we teamed up with the Colorado COMET team to really think about how we can deploy carbon farm planning at a larger scale. Right now, Jeff and I have been doing it through California for several years and having to travel all over the state. So now that we have this new online tool we can use with planning, it's really been able to help us deploy our messaging to a larger audience. So we've been able to create this online curriculum, and we have our goals and expectations here of this curriculum and how we use it. So what this curriculum involves is 3 modules. And module 1 is really introducing carbon farming, really introducing the role of carbon in our in agriculture today. And then we go through what those principles of soil health are and carbon farming on your farm. We designed this first module to be more of an education of carbon itself and the role of carbon. And we hope that this can be used for producers as well to understand more. So the link could be shared with them so they can have a little bit more education and background on this. One of the things I do want to say is that to help everybody learn, we tried to integrate it with several different options of whether we included videos for learnings to those who are visual, included a lot of reading material and text on that to those who learn better through reading and comprehension that way. And then we also provided a lot of different podcasts and clips of podcasts to help bring in other resources for people to learn from. Our second module is really, the second module in this curriculum is really about what tools are available for planning and really how to think about your landscape through a carbon lens. So one of the things we do in our trainings is we do a virtual landscape tour, and we had to create this because we haven't been able to do in-person trainings. So really thinking about what your landscape looks like, and we're thinking about on a farm scale what that landscape looks like and how to read that and read it with the surrounding influence of that watershed. And then the last module really focuses on developing a carbon farm plan, building out tables, building out models and tools, create how you bring a plan together with different chapters, whether those chapters are grazing, your dairy systems, integrating that nutrient management component into it, or thinking about what your agroforestry is, and really developing that land-based systems of what those different system types are. One of the reasons we do set it up very specifically into chapters is we like to think of it that one chapter can be pulled out and stand alone. So if you're seeking funding of some sort, maybe the producer doesn't want to share the whole plan, so you can just pull out the agroforestry section and really understand what the capacity is for agroforestry on that landscape. So that gets me to how we utilize this online curriculum with our CCI trainings. What we normally do is we do an introductory webinar to talk about who we are, the background of CCI, and the background of carbon farm planning. So basically that would be what we're doing today. And then before we start our trainings, we have the participants who are in our trainings go through module 1 that I just explained to you. And then we have them complete the task at the end of module 1. So webinar 1 is really focused on what we're seeing from the task that was that the participants completed. We do this a little backwards, I guess, different than traditional education. We do it this way because we want everyone to self-guide themselves through those modules, and then we follow up with a webinar to really focus on what we're seeing that people aren't understanding concepts to. So it's really important that we have everyone go through the tasks so we know what we need to focus our training on. Our trainings do not go over the actual modules, all the content of the modules, but they really focus on helping to to educate the participants that are in that training, and we tailor each of our webinars to that group of participants. So then following on, then after webinar 1, you would go through the self-guidance of module 2. And then webinar 2, we would go through a little bit of module 2, what you learned in module 2, what you needed more assistance in learning on, and then the same for module 3. And then webinar 3, we really focus on a tailored exercise and task of building a mock carbon farm plan and really integrating all the tools that we've taught you and into a small little plan. And we do go through all of these exercises, read them, and provide feedback to make sure that everybody is understanding the concepts. So that being said, I'm going to move on a little bit here. So one of the things that we've been also doing through CCI is really thinking about advancing carbon farm planning and implementation at different scales. So really where it all starts for us is really planning at the field and farm scale. So over here, this is another map of a carbon farm plan. And so as we were saying earlier, we have the Marin Carbon Project. The Marin Carbon Project that is composed of different organizations is still working together very closely. And so one of the things that we've been able to do in Marin, because they were the first to start this, they have the most carbon farm plans, is really thinking about how we can aggregate those plans and really think about the landscape and county scale and how these carbon farm plans that we've created really go into helping with understanding what our county can plan for and how we can aggregate those plans and create input into our county climate action planning and how that can help influence policy for us to get more dollars and implementation on the ground. And then that also moves forward into how we can regionally scale this from a county level to our state scale. And so, like I said earlier, us scaling this, meaning we've created hubs aggregating different resource conservation districts, and those hubs work together, really scoping out planning and thinking about how we can motivate policy in our state, and then within our state and nationwide growing this, what that really looks like on the national and global scale and global climate change. So how carbon farming and these solutions can influence at different scales through implementation. And Jeff, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, only to say that it is interesting, as we scale up, we can scale up conceptually and jurisdictionally and from a government perspective, but ultimately the work has to happen on the ground, and it happens at the farm scale. So there is this direct nexus between the work on the ground, the planning that gets done at the farm scale that can then be scaled up, as Lynette says, through the county and the state and ultimately the national level and global. But ultimately all of that only becomes real when the work gets done at the farm scale.
All right. Jeff, this is your slide.
Okay, thanks, Linda. So I think it's pretty clear that we couldn't do any of this work without the engagement of our resource conservation districts in California. And as we look across the country, all of those districts that were put in place as really sort of the national response to the Dust Bowl era are obviously all doing good work, as you folks are doing in Wisconsin. And the opportunity to engage our soil and water conservation districts, resource conservation districts, et cetera, across the country in this work is very real. It's a question of, can we bring the attention of our state and federal agencies to this work, and can we bring in the resources? So I think you're all very familiar with the role of these districts, and we could probably go on to the next slide. Ultimately, the idea here is that through carbon farm planning, we can actually generate a climate beneficial agriculture. And this particular photo here is from a project up into the northeastern part of the state of California, where we worked with one of the state's premier wool producers to develop a comprehensive carbon farm plan for their farm, with the idea of just simply answering the question, would it be possible for them to produce wool in a way that would be climate beneficial? Next slide, please. Ultimately, once we completed the plan and we dove into the literature to look at life cycle assessments for wool production, we came to the conclusion that implementing their carbon farm plan would offset the greenhouse gas emissions from their wool production by 6 to 10 times. So we really felt, we didn't know if we were going to find that through this process, but we did. And that was extremely gratifying and really gave us some momentum around this idea of a climate beneficial agriculture. Next slide. This work was facilitated and partially funded by a partnership with North Face. So North Face was interested in seeing whether it would be possible to source a climate beneficial wool. And through the carbon farm planning process, we identified that potential. And so North Face has continued to have a relationship with this producer and has developed actually a whole line of clothing coming off of this particular ranch, telling this story of the relationship between farming and the climate through this supply chain network. Next slide. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Organic Valley. We worked very closely with Organic Valley in the development of 3 carbon farm plans for 3 dairies in our California coastal region here. And then Organic Valley was able to tell that story as part of their marketing effort. So this, and in the process, they were supportive financially of their producers in both getting those plans written and then subsequently beginning to implement practices on farm that some of which are shown here, that we're supportive of those farms actually becoming climate beneficial sources of dairy products. Next slide. We carried out a pretty in-depth analysis for our local county, Marin County, looking specifically at, as part of the county level climate action plan that was developed this past year. We looked very closely at our dairy industry. That plan really only had one number for agriculture within the plan as drafted, and that was an emissions value, which you can see there, 118,000 metric tons of CO2 per year, largely coming from manure management, enteric fermentation, and fertilizer application. And we asked the question, well, what could our dairies do if they set their minds to it and really worked at becoming carbon beneficial enterprises? And you can see here that through a series of practices, some alternative manure management, some utilization of compost, developing on-farm agroforestry sources for wood chips to commingle with dairy manure for compost production, restoring our riparian areas, and then integrating some feed supplements to reduce enteric methane emissions. And we've had some good local results here, reducing emissions by about 75% from using this red algae feed supplement. We could more than offset, more than double our emissions with sequestration of carbon and avoided methane emissions. So you can see that once we decide we're going to do this and we put the resources to do it, we can actually turn this whole equation around and make agriculture a very significant part of not just the climate solution, but also address a whole suite of environmental issues at the same time. Next slide. So ultimately, our goal is not really to produce carbon farm plans at all. It's to produce carbon farmers, right? It's to engage agriculture in this process to the point where we all understand it, and we're all working for this because it serves the goals of agriculture, right? It's not just about an abstract relationship with climate, but rather directly impinges on how we farm and how successful and sustainable and productive our farm systems are going to be over the long term. And we've been really gratified by the response of our producers as we engage. And it's an in-depth process. It's not a simple process, but the outcomes, both in terms of producer understanding and producer engagement and producer action, have been really spectacular from our perspective. So next slide. Yeah, I think that's it.
That's our presentation for today. And here are our contact information if you do want to contact us, and a link to our website if you would like to navigate to our website to learn a little bit more. Right now, we do have several questions, so I think that we can address these, and also possibly if you want to ask us a question directly, you can raise your hand, and Christina can help unmute you to ask us a question. So I'm going to start at the bottom. We have quite a few questions. Are there credit programs for ag land as there are for forested land? I'm going to let Jeff answer this.
There are some protocols for agriculture, but they're very few and far between, and they have not been widely adopted. And I think that's largely because frankly, the costs associated with implementing those protocols tend not to be met by the value associated with the payment. So in other words, the price set on carbon dioxide for agricultural projects simply isn't high enough at this point. I think it'll get there. I do believe we'll see a price on carbon that will entice producers to engage in those protocols, but we're simply not there. There are a few groups, Indigo Ag comes to mind, Nori comes to mind, that are giving payments to farmers for sequestration efforts. But again, I personally look at those, the value per ton, they're tending to run around $15 a ton. That does not strike me as incentive for a producer. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, and then let's see. We got next. How much time is needed to create a COMET farm plan for a given farm? Can data collected for other conservation planning tools be input or coupled with the COMET tools? And how to save time for the farmer and the staff member entering the data? That's a great question. Here in California, we do not use COMET Farm all that often because it doesn't work as the amount of time put into creating a COMET Farm run is actually very time consuming. It's based on specific fields and pastures. And we're noting that COMET Planner is much easier for us to use. It's quicker, and we use that as a planning tool. And then in our training, we actually do invite the COMET team to go through both COMET Farm and COMET Planner and do a run through, so we can give everyone an idea of how much time it does take, what type of data you need to collect, and what the differences are within those tools.
And I would say, if there is data that might come from a previous conservation planning effort that could certainly be utilized within the carbon farm plan itself. So it is a time-consuming process, but yes, those previous planning efforts can certainly come into play in developing the carbon farm plan.
All right. Given that nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas, have we looked at nitrogen gases and the cycle concurring to our evaluations in carbon?
So we will look at nitrous oxide emissions. I mean, nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas, as you all know. In some cases, it's in fact, in many cases, if a producer is using a synthetic form of nitrogen, we can quantify the nitrous oxide emissions from that, and then propose an alternative means of providing nitrogen that may avoid those emissions. So, so we do, if it's a significant issue, we will look at that. Yeah, it certainly can be part of a carbon farm plan. Again, I want to emphasize that these plans are quite individual. They're really evolved from a conversation between the planner and the producer. And so it's really on the planner to identify where the opportunities are and to share those and explain those to the producer. And it's in that conversation that the plan evolves and emerges.
Okay, thanks for that, Jeff. All right, let's see what we have next. Christina, how much time do we have on answering questions?
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left, and then I think, yeah, if there are additional questions, we can always answer them and send them back out to the group afterwards as well. Yeah, we've got a lot of really good questions.
Yeah, okay. Here we go. How would you evaluate certified organic production systems as systems of production that are climate friendly and smart?
Well, that I would take that on a case-by-case basis. You know, as everyone knows, organic farming began with a real focus on soil organic matter. And going all the way back to the work of Sir Albert Howard and others. That focus has not always been strong within the organic framework, but it is there. And I think the question is, that really comes down to the individual farm level. So we would certainly like to think that organic farming was carbon farming. It certainly historically, I think, very much was that way. And I think it certainly can be that way. There's a natural fit there. But I certainly can point to examples of organic farmers who are not necessarily managing in a way that fully takes advantage of the opportunities of their particular farmscape. And that's where the carbon farm planning process linked to an organic farm operation, I think, has enormous potential. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Have we explored using biochar and compost in experiments like the Marine Carbon Project? In general, what is your view of using biochar?
Yeah.
We actually did a whole entire cafe hour on this that I could distribute if anybody's interested in learning more, but Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, we have certainly done some compost trials integrating biochar. Biochar is, it's not a one size fits all product. Biochar can be made from different materials and in different ways. Its use may or may not be called for depending on the soils to which it's being applied. So I think there is certainly a place for biochar in this conversation, no question of that. However, the origins of the material, the way it's made, and the soils to which it's deployed are all important factors in trying to decide whether or not using biochar is actually a climate beneficial practice or not. So it's not a simple, there's no simple answer there, but there's definitely a place, in my opinion, and from everything I've read, there's definitely a place for biochar in this conversation, no question.
Okay. We have another question related to supplements. So Diane says, I'm concerned about the red algae supplement excitement based on one relative short term study with no assessment of GHG emissions and other environmental impacts of scaling up harvest of algae. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I think it's an important point that any so-called solution that we come up with in any level in any of this work needs to be looked at in a whole system context. Just as we just talked about biochar, same thing, right? Biochar may last a long time in the soil, but if it's leading to the degradation of a forest system or some other system in order to generate that biochar, there's clearly, it's not going to work. I've seen a couple of red algae studies now that look very promising. I know that folks are starting to look at farming red algae for this purpose. So I think there's whether it turns out to be Asparagopsis or some other algae, or whether it doesn't pan out as folks hope. I think it's early days, but I think that there are definitely some pretty interesting signs that there may be some opportunities there. But I certainly agree that we would want to look clearly at or carefully at how that material is being produced and harvested and so forth.
Okay. Another question here. Is there a professional certification associated with becoming trained in carbon farm planning? Have we worked with American Society of Agronomy to obtain credits or the Certified Crop Advisor program? Thus far, we've mainly worked with in North Carolina, and the NRCS has provided additional education credits. When we worked with Cal Poly this past month, they had looked into providing credits through this Society of Agronomy. I think it's different case by case depending on who we're doing the training with. So in Wisconsin, Christina, I'm not sure if you guys are offering continuing education credits for this class or not. We do provide a certificate of completion. I do know that the NRCS is thinking about how they can roll out a training program as well. So we do provide a certificate of completion just to help facilitate that. Christina?
Yep, and we have been working with our CSU or our NRCS office that distributes the CEUs, and you just have to put in the rest of our paperwork, but it seems as though that should be no problem. We'll update that. I did put in the chat, I put a link to our save the date that's in our events calendar. So we will be posting registration to that training, and I'll make sure any CEU or credit information is updated there. But thanks, Kevin, about the agronomy. I can check into that as well.
Okay. I think we have time maybe for what? Another question or two. We have 2 minutes left. Do you need a minute to wrap up?
No, I think that we're all set. If you want to just ask, we can finish a couple questions, and any extra we can send out to the group.
I'd like to answer this one. Can carbon
Sure.
farm planning work in all types of ecologies? Or might one suspect that California is different than Montana dryland systems and Wisconsin rainfed, et cetera? And my answer is carbon farming absolutely can and does work in all types of ecologies. All we're really talking about here is managing that flow of solar energy basically into our vegetation, and then how do we manage it subsequently. So every system clearly is going to be different. Our precise model is not going to translate to Montana or to Wisconsin, but there's no question that we're talking about basic fundamental biological principles here and ecological principles that apply across the globe. So it's just a question of customizing the system, developing your own locally relevant approach to this work.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that's really great and a great way to kind of to wrap up. And thank you both so much for participating and joining us. It's been really great to learn about the experiences from California, which you guys have been working on with our partners at the Resource Conservation Districts, as well as I did attend the North Carolina module, which is why I've been so excited to bring this to Wisconsin. And thanks to Sarah for their support and allowing us to do so. Again, our webinar or workshop, virtual workshop and modules that Lynette described, we will be providing that in January. I have the save the dates. It's a few Tuesdays will be the live webinars, and the link again is in the chat. We'll get that out to our members in the following weeks. But if you are not a county in Wisconsin and are interested, just shoot me an email at Christina CHRISTINA. I can throw it in the chat too, at wisconsinlandwater.org. And I can make sure that you get on our list. So thanks again so much. And we will be in touch. And thanks to Jeff and Lynette for sharing your great information with us.
All right.
Thank you very much.